So it's week 2 of advanced web programming. Today we're going to do a look at some basic JavaScript so that when we get started writing Node.js code next week, I know we just dabbled in it a little bit last week, we'll be a little more familiar with some of the structures and some of the unique characteristics of JavaScript. So there's a bunch of stuff for you in here in week 2. One thing I want you to open, if you can open up in a tab, this online JavaScript console. This is a neat little tool. So when you open it up, now I've got my JavaScript in my console already enabled. If you open it up, you may have this. You might see this instead. I think you probably see HTML and output. I'm not sure. Okay, so if you don't, we want to open up JavaScript in console and we want to close down everything else. So this allows us to test out our JavaScripts online without having to develop, compile, run a whole program. We can just try stuff here. So for example, they've given us some sample JavaScript where they're setting up a few variables, doing a math operation, logging to the console. We want to execute it. It'll run and give us the output of the script. So we're going to leave this tool open today. This is kind of a useful tool. We're going to try a few different functions and some commands in JavaScript, and we can just run them in this little browser tab to see what happens when we execute them. So I'll just leave that open for now. So I just want to talk about, I guess, some of the basic features of JavaScript. Some of the syntax rules. We talked a little bit about them some of these things last week. So your JavaScript code is going to look very similar to Java in terms of how it treats white space. JavaScript compiler ignores it, just like a Java compiler would. Okay. We talked about semicolons last week, whether we need them, whether we didn't. Well, let's try this. So typically, like in all C-based languages, like you did with PHP, like you've done with Java, commands are going to end with a semicolon. But what happens if we take them out? As if we try and run this now, is it going to run, or do you think it's going to give us an error? Well, so in JavaScript, the semicolons at the end of your commands, they're actually optional. The JavaScript compiler will assume they're there, unlike in PHP. If we wrote multiple commands in PHP, we're going to get errors. Now, my advice is it's still a good idea to use the semicolons in JavaScript. Okay? And part of the reason is if we're going to go back and forth between JavaScript and PHP, well, we can leave semicolons out in JavaScript. It's going to crash our PHP scripts. So it's probably good to still being in the habit. And as well, later on next semester in summer, when you come back in the fall, you're going to be doing enterprise computing. And in C#, well, those semicolons are going to be required again. Part of the other reason I would recommend using the semicolons is most of the documentation you read with JavaScript uses the semicolons. So you want to be consistent. That is still the recommended style, although you can see my code does work without them. In Java, this would fail, most likely. Guess I better make that a little bigger. So our JavaScript is it's case sensitive in one way and it's not case sensitive in another. So the keywords in JavaScript, those aren't case sensitive. So things like if and for, you can write if with a capital I, you can write it with a lowercase I, it's going to behave the same way. What is case sensitive are any objects that you give names to. So controls on your form, any variables, any functions, all of those things are case sensitive. Okay. So I've got no chalk here. Oh, yes, I do. So this and this are considered two completely different things in JavaScript. They're not connected. They're not related in any way. So typically in JavaScript, we're going to use, most developers and most code samples you see, they're going to use camel case. You're all familiar with it, I'm sure. So camel case, and where the first word is in lowercase. That's the convention. All of the JavaScript samples you see online, any textbook you look at, they're going to use this kind of convention. You won't see underscores, things written in all lowercase or all caps. We're going to use camel case. You're probably, I assume most of you are used to using that from Java, in any case. You know what? It might be. It's been so long since I've done Java. Did you use upper camel case in Java like this?
And we are in one of our courses right now.
Is your variable?
Yeah, let's say this is a variable.
Lowercase, just lowercase.
So you do it in lowercase, but you've seen it in uppercase in one of your courses?
Only for class.
Is it C-sharp?
Yeah, in C#. In the Microsoft world, things don't typically start that way. So yeah, you'll see this if it's C#. You'll see this. And you might use this when you do ASP.NET.
Oh yeah.
Right? But in JavaScript, typically we're going to see that structure. Okay? I'm not going to read these to you. So these are just some of the rules about variables in terms of characters, how they have to be created. And as I said, we're going to see camel case. So here would be, these would all be considered valid variable names. Something like tax rate, though, that's going to be what we're going to most commonly see. So we're not going to see underscore notation typically in JavaScript applications. I'm going to encourage you, as probably all your teachers encourage you, please name your variables descriptively in JavaScript, not variable 1, variable 2, variable 3, or A, B, C. It's not very helpful. It's not very helpful to you. It's not very helpful to other developers. And many times you're going to have to go back and look at your old code years down the road. So the more descriptive you name things, the better you are with your comments, the easier it is for you to be able to update your old code. Here's a list of all of the reserved words in JavaScript. Again, this would be similar to Java, so you're not going to be able to use any of these for function names or variable names. You're going to throw an error if we do this. Okay, we can try one of these. So if I take one of these, I'll throw it in my JS bin. If I just grab any one of these, like that's interesting. Let's try something else. So it's not going to let me use the function reserved word as a variable name, for example. That's a very good question. I'm going to try something else from this list. I don't know why it allowed me to use private. I didn't expect that it would. No, it's not going to let me. So it says it's a reserved word. It may have to do with the version of JavaScript that they're using on this site. May not be using the most current version. Here, yeah, I think if I pick ES6, I'm going to try it. Yeah, when I use ES6, which is the latest version, I don't get an error, but it isn't going to work either. Okay. The other thing we should talk about for a minute with variables, and I should probably update this, it's a little bit dusty, is for years in JavaScript, we declared variables with the keyword var. Now, how would that be different if this was a Java variable or a C# variable? What would we have instead of the word var? Yeah, we'd have a type. So in this case, what type would you use? Yeah, we'd use a string. Okay. So for all of the previous versions of JavaScript, JavaScript is loosely typed. So when you declare a variable, you don't declare a data type. A variable can hold any type of data. Okay. So for years and years and years, we've used the keyword var to indicate that something is a variable. Now, since 2015, when the latest version of JavaScript called ES6 came out, we started to see a different construct. Does anybody know what other word would we more commonly see instead of var nowadays for a JavaScript variable? You want to take a guess? Also three characters. Well, 3-letter word. Sorry? We're commonly going to see this instead. So let only works in the latest version of JavaScript. So when you're looking at JavaScript code or code samples, if the code samples are a bit older, variables be declared with the keyword var. If it's ES6 from 2015 or newer, we're probably going to see let more commonly. Both will work. So I put up a link here. This is a link to a pretty good discussion about the difference between var and let. And there's some good samples here. Basically has to do with scope, variable scope. And probably the best example I can give you is if we have a look at this code here. So here we have two functions. In the first case, we're using let for our counter variable. When we use let, this variable is only available inside of that looping function, because that's where we're declaring it. If we try to reference it down here, that variable doesn't exist. So let is not global to the whole function. It's only available to inside our for loop where we're declaring it. When we use var, we're declaring it inside our loop, but it's still going to be available after our loop finishes. So we can still use var, but more and more with JavaScript code, we're going to see let being used instead of var. So many of the examples, now this is fairly new, so many of the examples we look at, we're going to see var. In fact, I think I still have them in my own slides, which I really need to update. But moving forward, we're going to see let. So I've always used var when I've taught the course before, but really we should be using let. So we're going to use let in most of our code samples for declaring variables.
Var will not be available outside the function.
Right. Now var, so let's say we wanted to print var down here. It's not going to work. It's only available within this by E40 function. But let is even more restrictive. So not only is it available just within this function, it's only available within the code block where it's first declared. There's a question on your face.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I just solved it.
If I declare a var in the function, the first one, and then declare like let to
If you declare it within a function, it's only visible within that function. So let's try this in JSBin. Okay. So let's write function 1 var. Is this kind of what you meant?
no, like in the first function.
Yep.
If you declare another variable with let in the for loop, will it work or not? With the same name.
Good question. Okay. Well, right. Okay. So I'm going to create a variable called a. Can I then write a for loop and say let a? Good question. Let's try it. So I've got the same variable name declared in one function, once with var and once with let. What's going to happen? Well, we can already see that the editor's probably not happy with that. Whoops, actually, should log out. Let's log out A, both before and after the loop. So they're treated as separate items because one is declared with var and one is declared with let. Yes, you cannot well, let's try it. We can't. So they're considered completely independent when we use let. If I used var for both, notice the result. It's the same variable. So in effect, we're redeclaring A with var. But it keeps going. So first we get the text value, then we get 0, 1, 2 in the loop, and then 3 outside.
Why didn't it print 3 in the loop?
Sorry?
It should have printed 3 in the loop also. It should have printed twice.
No, because it's only while it's less than 3. So it goes 0 the first time, then 1, then 2. It increments again, but it doesn't print the third time, but it's been incremented to 3, and then we're printing it out after the loop, which is why we get it here. So you can see that var and let, they behave very differently. As I said, var is going to someday be deprecated, and let will be the standard. I mean, var has its uses, but they're rare. We don't really need to use var unless we have a variable where we have a particular instance in terms of the scope that we want to manage in some way.
Declare, but I guess can you call var int or string or anything like that instead, or is it?
No, because, and here was the other link I put up here. So I gave you a couple links. So there's some good conversation. So if you want to read more about it, that whole discussion on Stack Overflow on var and let is worth looking at. The other link I gave you here, another discussion is JavaScript loosely typed? So, sorry, I guess we don't say it's loosely typed, it's untyped because you cannot declare a type. We'll actually get an error if we do. This is part of what makes it run quickly. So if we try this, let me just clear my bin here. So if I say, so something like this, is that what you meant? Do I have any way? Yeah, it doesn't know what to make of that. That makes no sense. It just has no, it does some implicit data typing. So for example, if we tried to do something like this, let's say let A equals right? So it's implicitly doing some typing here, right? It's not trying to perform math and throwing an error, for example. It's going to say, well, one of these is a string, so we're going to assume the second one is a string as well.
Now, by not actually having integer or string or anything or double, do you have to create your own errors or mark them in? Because, when
No, we do. There are some parse functions. So for example, I can explicitly try to cast that, parse that as a numeric value. And in that case, now it's going to give me. So we have a toString method. We can parse numbers as ints or floats. So when we want to force something and make sure, so we can do some data typing, but we have to tell JavaScript to do it. So you can see how this is quite different than working with Java or C#. Okay. So it plays very loosely, or rather than saying it's loose, it's really that it's untyped. And there's a pretty good definition here. So on the one hand, you know, the typing's good because it's flexible. On the other hand, it can be problematic because it's going to catch fewer errors. That a more strongly typed language is going to know, hey, this value is the wrong data type. We don't want to accept this. An untyped language, it won't necessarily throw us errors when we get a value that isn't of the right type. Right? So we have to do a little more work on our own to check those things.
Is there any way to declare a variable in a function but make it global before the
If you want to make it global, you have to make it global outside of the function. So again, so it's global by being declared outside of the.
But if I want to declare it in a function, make it global, I can't do it.
No, if you declare it in a function, it won't be global. Okay. We also have the ability to declare constants in JavaScript. So any value that we want to set once and we never want that value to be changed, we can use the const declaration for that. Okay, so that value cannot be modified. It's read only. So we're going to use let. I don't think there's really many use cases. If you read some of that discussion about, well, where would we really need to use var? Nobody's really, that I've read, made a compelling case why we ever really need var instead of let, now that we're working with more modern JavaScript. So again, keep in mind, we'll see it in code samples, but the code we write, we're going to use let instead. We may as well use ES6, which is the new standard. This is nothing new. So JavaScript uses dot notation. So name of an object, dot, call a method, or name of an object, dot, property. So same in C#, same in Java. So although JavaScript is untyped, so we said when we're declaring variables, we can't actually give that variable a data type. There are still some implicit data types. So in JavaScript, the numeric data types are simpler than in some other languages. Basically, we don't necessarily, when we're working with a number, we don't have to say this is an integer or this is a decimal or this is a floating point number. JavaScript just kind of can work with any number in the same way. It does obviously have a Boolean. It has a string. Those are our basic data types. All the math operators, I'm not going to go through these. These are basically the same as what you would have done with C#, what you would have done in Java. There's nothing new in terms of how to perform calculations, order of operations, all that stuff's the same. One operator to pay special attention to, and I think the code example makes it pretty obvious. We're going to use this a lot. What does plus equals mean? What does it do? Right. So take the value. If it's a numeric value, take the existing value and then add on to that existing value. If it's a text value, then yeah, you said we're gonna concatenate. So we're gonna keep the existing string and we're gonna add more text onto the end of it. So we're gonna use plus equals a lot, both working with numbers, doing calculations as a shorthand, as well as appending and concatenating strings. It's much easier to do this.
Does plus equals only work in JavaScript? Or is it?
No, it will work in other C-based languages. Have you used it in Java at all? I don't even know if it exists. It exists in C# for sure. So something like this. We clear and run this. So the other way we can write this obviously is x equals x plus 10. We'll get the same. We can. So we're gonna use that function a lot in the course. It saves us time. These ones, this slide is useful, good one to reference. So here's how we escape things in our strings. So how we can create a new line, how we can enter, if we're already inside of quotes and we need to insert a quote into a string, we can escape it with a backslash or do tabs. All of these slides are on Blackboard as a reference. They're all right here, this intro to JavaScript. You don't really need to take any notes. They're all here. You'll have access to it at any time during the semester. So actually, we looked at this one already. So we have parse int and parse float when we explicitly want to convert a value to a number. If that value is not numeric, we'll get this. Anybody ever seen that before? NaN? Yeah, so NaN will give us not a number. So something like if we try convert that value to a number, oh, I actually got an error. So if we see NaN, it means our value isn't numeric.
This one then should be a lowercase, I think.
Ah, good point. Let's see. I don't think so. I think the function names are not case sensitive. Oh, yes, you're right. Thank you. I guess it is. So let me clear it. So when I try to convert that to a new number, I get NaN. There is also an isNaN function that will tell us if a value is numeric or not. So we can do a check. We can say if, for example, not is NaN.
It's not a.
I think second and also needs to be the uppercase.
So you put not in front of not a number, it's already a not.
Right. So we can use this before we try to perform math. We can validate that we've got a number with the isNaN function. So all of this stuff, again, would be similar to what you're used to with comparison operators. Just a reminder, we need, when we're comparing if two values are the same, you need double equals, not one equals. Here's something else new. We need to stop and talk about this for a couple minutes. There is an operator. We're actually starting to see it in C# as well. I doubt have you worked with triple equals before in Java? What is triple equals and how is it similar? How is it different from double equals?
Double equals check if the values are same and also the data types. Triple equal only checks if the data types are same.
No.
You're close.
Yeah, the formula is right, but they also check the type together.
Which one, double or triples?
Straight.
Right. So double will tell us if two values are equivalent. Triple will tell us if two values are equivalent and also the same data type. And we're going to see that in JavaScript a fair bit. Okay. So it's an extra layer of checking. So, all right. Take a minute. For each one of these, make a quick note. Either do it on your computer, just make a little text file. Or you can use Excel. I want you to note for each one of these, will they evaluate as true or false if we put it in an if statement? So is the value on the left the same as the value on the right? Give you a couple minutes and then we'll talk about them together. Actually, just going to step out, fill up my water so you figure out which are the same, which are different. All right, y'all done?
Yeah.
So we could just do something like this. Oops.
To comment out the previous solutions that you put up there instead of erasing.
That'd have been a good suggestion. Yeah, I should have put them in a file. I think it's probably too late for me to recapture them. I'll do that moving forward. I am live streaming it though, so it'll all be on. You can see them all in the video. But yes, moving forward, I'll do that. Thanks for that suggestion, Joel. All right, so if we run this one, what are we going to get? Same or different? All right. And if we use triple, what do you expect we'll get? So the first one is the same. So that's third equal sign makes a big difference. So in this case, again, we're not declaring anything. We're not declaring a data type, but what data types is JavaScript, is the JavaScript compiler assuming we have here when we use the triple. Yeah, so we've got an integer here, and we've got what here? And a Boolean there, right? So that triple equals are going to say those are different things. So value-wise, they're the same. Data type-wise, they're different. So then we have, oops. So we had one. What should we get here? And with triple, what do you expect? Sorry?
Create if else loop once and then declare variables and change the value of the variable.
Yeah, I could. It's
Then you can test every input.
I suppose that would be more efficient. I'll keep going with where I've done. This one's kind of interesting. So what do you expect we'll get here? So in that case, same. All right, anybody want to try and explain that one? How come with double equals, they're the same?
Actually, null has the variable, but undefined doesn't have variable itself. That's why it's different.
So null, that's right. So null indicates, so a variable, remember a variable means a place in memory in the computer's processor. So when we have a null variable, there's still space being allocated somewhere on the file system. There's just no value allocated to it. Yeah, it's an object that doesn't have anything in it. Whereas undefined is something that completely doesn't exist. It's not, so null is it exists, but it's empty. Undefined means it doesn't exist at all. Okay. So in this case, we have a variable, and remember our variables are untyped, whereas this is something that simply doesn't exist at all. That's the tricky one. And the last ones, well, probably we can guess which would be same and which would be different. First one is the same, and that one's going to be different. Again, a string and a Boolean variable. I can test them out if we want. So what do we have? Oops.
zero is need to be straight and false is need to be boolean. Type is opposite.
Oh, right. I had them. Yes, I did it this way. So again, a string compared to a Boolean, and a string compared to a Boolean. So just something to be aware of when we see that triple equals. We don't necessarily have to use triple equals. We'll see it fairly often. So if we think there's a need to check data types as well as values, we'll want to use that triple equals operator. So there are our answers. In each case, the double equals was true and the triple was false each time. We do have the same logic operators, so the exclamation marks that you've seen in Java, meaning not, the double ampersand, and the double pipe, meaning or. So those all work the same way. Our structure of our if statements would be the same. So we have three basic loops. We've got a while, a do while, and obviously the for loop we've already seen. The syntax for all those things is going to be familiar to you. We don't need to spend time going over them. Those are things you already know. Let's skip over this part. We should talk about functions. This is one of the things we played around a little bit with last week. In JavaScript, most of the time when we write functions, our functions are anonymous. What does that mean?
Function, but it doesn't have a name.
Well, right. So typically we've creating in Java, we're creating named functions. We say function, calculate tax, and then our input parameters and our function code. In JavaScript, we can create named functions, but we're not going to see that very often. We're typically going to see anonymous functions. And what we typically do instead, is we'll typically assign the function to a variable name. And then we simply call that variable name and can reference the variable. We're going to see that structure much more often. Also, keep in mind, remember, if our variables aren't strongly typed, then our function parameters also have no data types. So if we want a function with two parameters, x and y, we just have x comma y in here. There's no declaration. We don't have to say var x or int x or anything like that, as we would in Java. And we do have a return statement for sending something back. And also notice our function. So in Java, let's say we want to do a calculate function. Let's go back here, clear out my bin for a minute. So let's say in Java, we want to write a function that would calculate the tax, the HST. What might that function look like as a Java example? So we want a function where we can send in an amount, we can calculate the tax, and we can return the value of that tax. What would that function header look like? We have to write the code inside the function, but what would the header, the kind of the declaration look like? Okay, so what data type would you use? Okay, yeah, so. Yep. Okay, so yeah, we probably would have some kind of scope. Okay, what data type would you have? Okay. Okay, so what would you call it? Cost, okay. Parameters.
Need to type or
Okay, so what type of would we send in?
integer
It will be in the
strong, right? String.
Well, probably a decimal because it's going to be, we're dealing with money. So we probably have, or sorry, double. Yep. What would you call that parameter?
Just eight.
What are we sending?
Yeah.
So let's say we're building a shopping cart. Okay. So at the end, we have an order total and we need to calculate the tax on that amount. So this function is going to calculate and return the amount of tax.
So subtotal?
Yeah. So maybe subtotal. So that's maybe what our method header would look like. We've got a scope, which could be private, public, or protected. Right? We have a return type. We have a name of the function. We have an input parameter that's also typed. And then we have our function body in here, and eventually it returns some variable probably called tax, another double variable. So that's what it would look like in Java. What would this look like in JavaScript if we were going to use the anonymous function style?
Word cost equals to
So we could use var, or we'll use let. Yep.
function. It will be suppose
We don't use var or let for a parameter. We can just name it. So we've got the input parameters the same, but in Java, we're going to type it. In JavaScript, we're not going to type it. In Java, our function has a name. In JavaScript, our function is anonymous. And we don't declare any return type on our JavaScript function because JavaScript is untyped. Our function can return a value, but we don't have to declare a type attached to it. We also don't have to declare any kind of scope for our function as well. So there's kind of our JavaScript equivalent.
Is it possible then to finish off the entire thing by just saying like, where it says subtotal, just say times 1.13 and then console.log?
Sure. Okay. Let's we can write the function, right? So let's write the code in the function. So you said, okay, so we'll just say, well, rather than doing a console log, we'll still use a return function because we'll send it back. So it would look something like this.
If you go 1.13, then it's the cost including stuff.
Yeah, okay. So, all right. So I guess it depends whether we're calculating the tax or the, all right, if we want to be the overall cost. So if we want to display it, we would just do this. We're treating our variable like the function name. So this is the style of code we're going to be using in this course, right? If we were to go and do something here, again, we could finish off the Java version would probably look something like this, right? Double total equals. Yeah, we could do the return statement. So yeah, okay, I guess we could just do this, sure. And then how would we call that function if we wanted to execute it? Yeah, well, we'd still. No, it wouldn't be console log. What would it be in Java? If we wanted to print that,
Print.
something like that.
It's system dot.
Or yeah, system dot.
Yeah, system dot out dot.
Do you declare whether it's a printout, LN or?
So there would be our Java equivalent. And this would be the JS version. Now we could write it as a named function. We could just have this as function cost without the let and without the variable, but we won't typically see that. It would work, it is equivalent, but this is the structure we're gonna be seeing. So this is gonna take this takes a little while to get used to when we're used to seeing this. This seems, the Java version, it seems more clear and more explicit, particularly when we're declaring what type of data it accepts and what type of data it returns. JavaScript really has no notion of those things. So I'll just comment out the Java version. Okay. So this is typically what we're going to see. So we're treating the variable name as our representation of that function. It will execute the function for us. If that looks strange to you and you're having a hard time wrapping your head around it, that's fine. It should look strange to you. You've been coding in this style for a year now. Right? Would be like if we'd been teaching you Italian for a year and suddenly I showed you Korean today. Well, it's going to look pretty different. But the same way of just the JavaScript equivalent doing the same thing. Okay. And does anybody have any questions about this structure? The other place we're going to see that a lot, I'm just going to open up, we'll take a quick look at our code sample from last week for just a second. If I open up my non-blocking. So we can see anonymous functions here. Where do you see the anonymous functions? Right, so our callback functions are unnamed, right? So they can be passed as a parameter to another function, so our code can execute asynchronously and not block the rest of the commands. So we're going to see this over and over. We'll be writing these anonymous callback functions every week in this class. So pretty soon it's not going to seem so strange. It's going to become more familiar. And we did the same here where we were assigning a variable to the result of a function in that way. So there are some examples, similar examples here. So we'll see the occasional named function. We won't see very many of them.
Excuse me, pardon me, I'm not here.
So we basically have, well, we've got three options in terms of variable scope. Global, so global that would be declared outside of any function. It's going to be global within that file, right? And then local variables are going to be local within a function, and we've seen that we can use var or let depending on how accessible or how restricted we want to make that variable. But typically we're going to use let. Okay? If we don't use var, JavaScript just assumes it's global. That's the assumption. So we try not to create too many global variables. Generally, if a value, we need it to be accessible in multiple functions along the way, we're probably going to declare it in one and pass it as a parameter to others. All right. We do want to play around with arrays a little bit in JavaScript. So if you don't have your JS bin open yet, make sure that you open it up. We'll try a few examples. So arrays have, again, we treat them similar to how we do in Java. Usually if we want to loop through them, we're going to use for. JavaScript arrays have a length property. That'll tell us how many elements are in that array. And we can find any particular element using that particular index, which like Java, it's always 0 base, right? That first element will be 0 base. So some kind of basic examples, we can declare a numeric array this way. Again, remember our arrays, just like our variables, they're untyped. So even though we've put integers in here, we don't declare this as an array of integers. And our loop structure, well, was gonna look something similar. A little array, JavaScript array practice for you. In your JS bin, I want you to create an array called fruit. Inside it, put the names of 3 fruits you like to eat, and then in a loop, output each value in the array. So I'll put your instructions here. Well, you just have to be careful because if you need to declare it in the function, you'll use var or let and you treat it as global. You can, it's not recommended. If you want it to be global, you should declare it outside of the function. It's not recommended. It's not a good idea. So you're gonna need a for loop. These are strings, so you need some kind of delimiter around those to indicate they're strings. Yes, right. Well, here, no, that's weird. That's just weird. Yeah, you need to, right? Because if we add another element to the array, your loop doesn't work anymore. That's fine. It's just because it's a string value. It won't normally. That's just what the website's doing. Okay, we're not doing that example yet. I just want you to put 3 values in. You put in 3 values of your own. Work?
Yeah.
All right, so how did you declare your array?
Using
Okay. Equals, yeah. Square bracket indicating it's an array. And what's one thing in your array?
Great.
Okay. Actually, I'll put in some. So if we're using string values, they've got to be in quotes. Could be single or double, doesn't matter. Scott, what's something in your array? All right. Tiffany, what's something in your array? Good choice. Okay. If you used var, that's fine. If you use double quotes, that's fine. But you do need quotes around each individual value. Single. You can use double quotes. The standard is to use single. Okay. And in fact, I should mention this. I put a link up here. This is a good reference. These are not rules, but this developer put up on GitHub, he documented the typical conventions for particularly Node.js. So he wrote things, for example, for quotes, we should use single quotes unless this is typically we're going to use double quotes for JSON values for our actual data, which is JavaScript arrays. We'll see double quotes around those keys and values. But when we're writing our code, we're going to see this rather than that. This will still work, but we won't see it. About where to put your braces, usually our opening curly brace is on the same line as our if commands. So this is a good reference. So again, here about using camel case and variables. So you can use this as a reference. This is, he sort of documented the style we're going to see typically when it comes to JavaScript, particularly server-side JavaScript with Node. So that link is right here for you to reference. Okay, so we've got our array. What about our loop? What's that going to look like? Use a for. Yep. And what goes in here? Okay. Yep.
And then I greater than or like whatever is
Greater than?
or less than
And how do we get? Right. So the fruit dot length, that'll tell us how many elements are in the array. We could say 3, but then if we go and change the number of items in the array, well, then our loop isn't going to be accurate anymore. If we take something out of the array, and we've said 3, we're going to get an index out of bounds error. And if we add more values into the array, and we've hard-coded to stop at 3, those new values are going to get excluded from our loop. And how do we want to increment I? Okay, so now how do we display each element? So now it loops. If we add something to the array, we don't have to change the for loop. It's just going to run. Right? If I add something else, somebody have another fruit in their list? Right, so however many elements are in the array, that length property, that counter is going to cycle, whether it's 4 or 4 million. Question?
Why we didn't use the food like variable instead of item in the for loop?
Sorry, why didn't we use?
Let I, can we use the fruit? Let I is equal to fruit is equal to 0. Like why do we declare two variables? Fruit and I.
Well, fruit is our array that holds all of the data. I is the counter. So we're starting, so I0 is the first element in the array. Fruit, then I becomes 1, and fruit 1 gives us the second element, which is banana. Okay, so the fruit is the whole list, and I is the each individual element. Okay, so we're going from 0 into the length of the array. Does that make sense? Okay, let's try one. I'll just comment out this loop for a minute. Actually, I'll comment out the console log for a second. This time, what I want you to do is display all of the fruits, but display it as a comma-separated list. Rather than having it display on separate lines, we want to build a list. Let's say we were going to generate a CSV file from that array. We wouldn't use this. How could we generate it looking like that as a single value, single line separated by commas? Okay, so what would that look like if, so here I'll make a comment. So 1 fruit per line was this version. Okay, so how would we do it? Would be a descriptive variable name.
I think we need to make a variable outside the home.
Okay, we could call it fruits, although that may be a little confusing to have fruit and fruits.
Yeah, variable should be.
Okay, I still don't find they're too clear. Maybe we could come up with a more descriptive name.
Fruit basket?
Yeah, maybe fruit list. Okay. Now, where should we declare fruit list? Yeah, it should be outside the loop. We don't want to declare it each time. We want to declare it once. So let's move that. Okay, so we could initialize it as an empty string. It's a good idea. Yes, it will work. We don't have to give it a default value. That part's optional. We can just say let fruit list. Just declare it.
So if we use like plus equal the next time, will it not give an error?
Well, let's nope. So what would we do? So now so fruit list. Yep, so we'll append on. Yeah, what about, okay. Okay, and now let's try logging this out. See what happens. We try it. So we'll populate our array. We'll set up our string variable. And now inside our loop, we're just going to add on the name of each fruit and a comma. See how that runs. Pretty good. Except we have a comma at the end, which we wouldn't want if we were creating a CSV file. It's then going to put a blank value at the end. So what could we do? There's a few ways we could do this. What could we do so that we get a comma after all the values, but not after the last one?
Can we include brackets? Because my output is brackets around it and then the fruit list.
You put brackets.
Well, what mine looks like is it's got brackets on either end, like the output has brackets on either end, and it's just the fruit separated by commas.
Is there a comma at the end though?
Nope. Mine, I go let fruit equals and then bracket bananas, apples, mango, grapes, and then under that I just put console.log and fruit, and it prints it out.
Yes, well that would be, well that's true. We could just print the whole array. If I just logged the whole array and ignored the fruit list, that would work. So we get it as an array. That would be that. But if we want it this way, what could we do? Cindy, you have an idea? Okay, so how would you do that? So I like that idea. So let's append on that. Yep. Okay. So long as we're not at the last one, as long as we're not at the end, put a comma on after each fruit. Let's try that. Good solution. That works well. So append the name of the fruit and then check where we are in our array. So long as we're not at the end of the array, add a comma. But once we're at the end, we're going to skip this so we have no comma on the end. We'll have to do this commonly. You may be doing this when you're writing an SQL command, when you're building a where clause and you're saying and this, and this, and this. But at the end, we don't want the word and after the last condition. So we need to know if we're at the end or not. Sorry?
A ternary operator.
Yeah, we could do that too. We could set some kind of flag. Yep, that's another way of doing it.
We can join the array by using the function join.
Yep, that'd be another option.
Try to use loop.
Well, typically when we have an array, when we're processing it, typically we're going to loop through it to iterate through. I mean, in this case, we're building a string, so we don't have to use a loop because we're building a string. But most of the time when we're looping, we're actually doing some kind of processing inside the loop as opposed to just building a string.
Are there substring functions?
Yes. So the same kinds of string functions you would find in Java, you'll find in JavaScript. So like in string, substring, yes, we have those functions.
Just cut off that last one.
Yep, we could do that too. We could chop off the last character.
Would that take like more, would it be worse than looping through and checking or?
You know what? It's probably more efficient to just take the string and chop off the last character. It's probably actually faster from a performance point of view. But there's many different ways we could accomplish that same thing. Okay, it's 20 after 12, so I think this is a good place for us to take a break. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video stream. I'll leave this. When we come back, I want to do one more thing, one more practice using a multi-dimensional, two-dimensional array in JavaScript, and then I'm going to give you a lab, a little JavaScript game, and that'll be it for today. Okay, so I'm actually, often the labs will be take home. Today's lab you can do in class. I'll give you time in class to get it done. Then you won't have to do it at home. Okay, so let's take 20 minutes here. Sure.